Our guest today is Dave Meyers, a partner of Troutman Pepper down in Richmond, Virginia. Dave is one of those jack of all trade lawyers, knows everything corporate law, securities law, corporate governance related. I've known him forever. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. So Dave, compensation-related risk disclosure under item 402S of Regulation SK. This disclosure is only required to the extent that risks arising from a company's compensation policies and practices for its employees are reasonably likely to have a material adverse effect on the company, MAE. That's a pretty high bar. So how often have you seen this disclosure made, affirmatively by a company?
Thanks, Brock. And as one of my favorite people, it's really a pleasure to speak with you today. So you don't normally see affirmative disclosure. In fact, I'm not sure that I have seen disclosure in the affirmative. I think when the original 402S was adopted, I think there might have been a company or two who talked about potentially a risk related to their pension plan fundings. But in general, I just haven't seen it in ever. And I don't know that it exists because I don't think companies would want to put out there that they actually have that type of exposure. And so generally you don't see it.
So you almost could consider this sort of as a governance requirement, even though it's framed as a disclosure requirement, because it essentially requires companies to monitor and review the risks that they have associated with their pay programs. So how do companies do that in practice?
Stepping back for 1 second, I think the SEC has made very clear in its comment process when this first came out that, as you said, you're only supposed to have the disclosure if, in fact, there are the risks rising from it, but they made it very clear that they wanted issuers to have the negative disclosure. And so we originally, we had a few clients who said, well, we don't have this issue, so we're not going to put anything in there. And the SEC would put out comment letters saying, well, tell us how you concluded that, what you based that on, and the process you undertook. And then also, tell us that you concluded that you didn't, the negative disclosure. And so because of that, you see almost all companies put out that negative disclosure, which leads into, well, how do you get to that determination? What we've typically seen is that in order to get to this, usually clients will work through a compensation risk inventory through the compensation committee management, and usually the independent compensation consultant will go through a bunch of analyses focused on the different risks related to the compensation program. So they do sort of an inventory. They look at strategic risk, the difference between short-term compensation and long-term, how that looks. They look at your pay, like I said, the pay mix risk. They look at a bunch of different risks: performance management risk, annual incentive risk, like the long-term incentive risk. And then they've always been doing risk management as part of the general CD&A and good governance. And so they look at all that, equity ownership. They look at all these factors and they sort of do this inventory and then help the compensation committee lead them through the findings so that they can conclude that there's not excessive risk taking in that and the negative disclosure. So that helps, that basis forms the disclosure. And so basically through the disclosure process, the SEC has basically developed a pretty thorough internal governance function by the company to make sure that they're looking at these risk issues with respect to their compensation.
Yeah, so as part of that negative disclosure statement in your proxy, you're going to have a discussion of the reasons why there's disclosure about risk was unnecessary, and then actually describe the process, the robust process that the company.
Yeah, so what you usually see is what we found is ISS and Glass Lewis, and then also a lot of your institutional investors, this is a big focus for them, compensation risk. And so they want to see that the negative determination that there's not excessive risk. And so we'll have disclosure about the actual determination, which is that they're not reasonably likely to have a material adverse effect on the company. Usually you also see that it doesn't encourage excessive risk taking as a disclosure, which is broader than the rule, but I think a lot of institutional investors like to see that. And then you get to the analysis. You usually see a pretty thorough analysis of these are the things that we looked at, sort of going back through that compensation risk inventory I talked about before, as to how that led to that conclusion that there's not excessive risk taking and not likely to be material adverse effect. you do see some disclosures where it's much more conclusory. They don't really go through the analysis, but we really recommend with our clients that you go ahead and at least go through sort of the analysis that led you to the conclusion. And I think a lot of institutional investors like that because it gives good insight into the compensation process. And I think it helps, therefore, with the say on pay vote when they see that.
And then where's this disclosure typically located? Is it embedded in CD&A because CD&A requires some risk disclosure about how the NEOs are paid, or is it broken out?
I think in the adopt and release, and since it's focused on company-wide risk, they expect it to be outside of the CD&A. I think CD&A always had a discussion about risk management with respect to the NEOs and that process. But for this, they want it outside of the CD&A. And there was also, I think they disclosed a CD&I about this that also said that since it's broader than 402B, it should be outside. And so you usually see it again where the narrative discussion is about your different compensation programs out, with this after this, the compensation tables. You usually see a standalone section on this, or within your governance section when you talk about, you have to now disclose about risk overall, board's evaluation of risk and how it's structured. And so you sometimes see it together with that. I've seen it both.
Great. Thanks very much, Dave.
Yeah, great.